this evening. He is a television producer, screenwriter, TV and film producer, director, and author. He has written 9 books, has a few others he's working on all the time. He's produced films for National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, you name it. He's appeared on CBS News, he's been on the Discovery Channel, he's been on CNN, Fox News. So we're very lucky to have this history enthusiast. I present you, RickBeyer.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stand over here. And can you guys hear me okay? Yes. I'm delighted to be back here. I'm just going to start right away. At about 7:30 in the morning on Wednesday, July 11th, 1804, Aaron Burr stood on an isolated piece of land underneath the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey, holding a pistol, just so. 30 feet away stood Alexander Hamilton holding an identical pistol. The same 2 pistols had been used in the same spot 3 years earlier in a duel that killed Hamilton's son. On this morning, Burr watched with icy disdain as Hamilton briefly held up the proceedings to fiddle with his glasses. Burr thought he read fear in Hamilton's eyes. He looked like a convicted felon, Burr said later. Finally, when both men were ready, Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, shouted, "Present!" What transpired in the next few seconds, and in what order, was bitterly contested by those present, and people have been arguing about it for 2 centuries. What is certain is this: Aaron Burr leveled his Wagner dueling pistol at Alexander Hamilton and pulled the trigger. Little sound miscue there. I don't have enough hands for this, okay? A 50 caliber lead ball left the muzzle at a speed of 545 miles per hour, traversed the distance between the 2 men in less than a 20th of a second, struck Hamilton's abdomen, hit a bone, ricocheted into his liver, and mortally wounded him. All right, now there, I've done it. I've given away the ending of my book. This is a murder mystery in which there's no mystery at all about who pulled the trigger. We know that Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. The mystery is in the why. The mystery is in the hearts of these 2 men. 1 week before the duel, they sat side by side at Francis Tavern in New York City for a gala July 4th dinner. 1 week before the duel. And there were toasts and songs and jests, and the rum and Madeira flowed like water. And there they were, the sitting Vice President of the United States and the former Secretary of the Treasury, to all the world enjoying themselves and having a great time and giving no hint that they had already set in motion their murderous plan to meet on the dueling ground. So how can that be? How can they sit there side by side calmly during that evening, yet be so filled with rage that they were determined to shoot it out a few days later? That's what we all want to know, right? And what makes the story even more interesting is that in Burr and Hamilton, we have 2 men whose complex differences seem to capture the raging conflicts of our young nation, conflicts that we're still afflicted with today. So the best way to understand the why of this story, I think, is to go back 30 years to the Revolution and trace the rivalry between the 2 men to see just what set them on their slow motion conflict, and that is what I have tried to do in my book, Rivals Unto Death. I thank you all for coming tonight, and I thank Sue for the great introduction. And wow, it's a full house, which is always really, really exciting anywhere that you go. Especially, you guys already heard me once. I was worried nobody would come because you knew what you were going to get. But I'm glad you're all here. I wonder if I could ask you, how many people here have actually been to see the musical Hamilton? Can you raise your hands? And that's nobody so far. That's fine. So how many of you might have heard part of the soundtrack of the musical Hamilton. We have a few more hands. Keep your hands up, please. And how many of you have some vague idea that there's some musical out there called Hamilton? Okay, I'm hoping that's mostly everybody. And if there isn't, come see me later. We've all, many of us at least, have been touched by the Hamilton phenomenon over the last few years. I call it the Haminomenon. And there's been no escaping it. My wife and I saw the show in Chicago on January 1st, and it was amazing. We really loved it. And the show is a brilliant weaving of fact and fiction. So when it comes to history versus Hamilton, let's understand that the show has a lot of stuff in it that's true, and it's a great piece of art, but it also makes up a lot of stuff, and it leaves a lot of great parts of the story out, like the Whiskey Rebellion and the Alien and Sedition Acts, or that time Burr fought a duel with Hamilton's brother-in-law, or that other time that Burr actually saved Hamilton's life. Well, you get the idea. And so to me, the great thing about this Broadway show is that it has gotten people excited and interested in knowing the real story of Hamilton and Burr. You want to be, as they say in the show, you want to be in the room where it happened. And in a very real way, my book owes its existence to Lin-Manuel Miranda and his show. And as it happens, this book also avenges a wrong inadvertently done to me by Richard Dreyfuss. And it allows me to name drop two great celebrities who I've never met. So here's the story. I started my career as a journalist and a radio reporter and a TV news producer. Then I became co-owner of an ad agency, and finally, at about age 40, found my calling making films and writing books about my great passion, history. And in a real way, I've kind of considered myself a journalist and a storyteller all along. I'm just storytelling about older stories now. And as an author, I got my start writing a series of books called The Greatest Stories Never Told, that each contain 100 stories from history to astonish, bewilder, and stupefy. And about 18 months ago, with Hamilton, the hottest ticket in town, the editor who shepherded my first book series into print called me up and invited me to write a book about Hamilton and Burr. Now, I don't know how much you know about the publishing business, but I can tell you that normally it's the writer desperately pitching the editor to try to get a book deal. I want to give you a clue that when the editor calls you and suggests you write a book for them, there is only one correct answer to that, which would be yes. Exactly. That's what I said. And I'm no stranger to the story. I love history, and I've been fascinated by this one, so I jumped on the idea. And the publisher had a hurry-up deadline. They wanted this book fast. But I had a hidden ace up my sleeve. A dozen years ago or so, I was all lined up to produce a documentary about the duel for the History Channel. In fact, I'd already started working on it, started doing the research, when suddenly actor Richard Dreyfuss decided that he wanted to make a show for the History Channel about this duel. And for some reason or other, they went with Richard Dreyfuss instead of me. Can you believe that? No, unbelievable. But things work out. So when this project came around, I had a head start, which I needed, given the fact that I had actually 4 months to write this book. This is last summer. I wrote this book last summer. I had a 120-day deadline and a 200-page limit. So starting out, I knew I wasn't going to be writing the exhaustive history of Hamilton and Burr. But those limits in a real way helped me to focus on the things that people most want to know, the good stuff, the most interesting parts of the story. So my goal was to bring to life the most important elements of the story, and I had 2 other goals as well as I got started. And one was, I wanted to try to take the Founding Fathers off the pedestal. Sometimes, when we think of our Founding Fathers, we conjure up an image, something like this one, a painting of the day that Jefferson and Adams and Franklin are presenting their draft of the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. And in this painting, the founders sit there, formal and dignified, great men thinking deep thoughts and about to do something solemn and important for America. And I think that that's a terrible piece of misinformation. Because these guys were not statues. They were flesh and blood human beings. And robing them in marble robs them of their humanity. This was a pretty fractious bunch. They were filled with ambition and jealousy and anger and ego. And that's how I wanted to present them. I mean, we don't normally think about George Washington cursing a blue streak like he did at the Battle of Monmouth. One of his fellow officers said he looked like thunder before the lightning flash. Or Thomas Jefferson whining about the length of speeches that other people, Alexander Hamilton, are making in cabinet meetings. We don't think about John Adams making caustic and vulgar remarks like the one he made about Hamilton, blaming his behavior, and I am quoting here, on a superabundance of excretions which he could not find whores enough to draw off. That's John Adams, right? I mean, we have a president now who tweets some unusual things. I think you might have run into this in the last few months. But I think John Adams could give him a run for his money. Now, Adams is one of 5 presidents who make it into this book. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And 4 of them get into shouting matches before the book is over. And the 5th one, James Madison, earns the nickname the Big Knife for his ability to cut deals. And the point I'm trying to make is that these guys were very human, warts and all, no different in many ways like modern politicians, no different than you and I. And yet they managed to build the foundations of America. They were not, I think this is an important point, this was not, deus ex machina, great, perfect, gods, Greek gods coming down from heaven to create our country. It was these flesh and blood people with warts and flaws and anger and ambition, and they managed to do it, and I think that's an extraordinary story. The other thing I wanted to do in writing this book is to be objective. History and popular culture have made Burr the cardboard cutout villain in this story, and most people who write about it tend to take sides, and most of them take Hamilton's side, including, of course, biographer Ron Chernow. I'm sure some of you have read Ron Chernow's wonderful book. Burr is often portrayed as one of the twin bad boys of early American history, along with Benedict Arnold. And it's interesting to note that Burr, at age, I think, 18, was Benedict Arnold's aide. So there's a good conspiracy theory for you to follow up on there. But, what do people say about Burr? Here's what one author said. He said, history has tagged Aaron Burr as a scoundrel, and history has it right. But if we start by viewing Hamilton as the hero and Burr as the villain, everything has to fit that narrative. And it isn't that simple, because just because Hamilton was a visionary doesn't make Burr a villain. So I thought it was important not to go into this book, writing this book, with the idea expressed on that screen, even though I am the author that wrote it in another book. So, okay, I guess I had my own biases going into the story, but I tried to put them aside and approach Burr as an objective reporter. And when you do that, you learn some interesting things. Burr was, in fact, a war hero. He was a feminist. He was an abolitionist. He was a supporter of immigrant rights, much more so than that immigrant Alexander Hamilton. He was a patron of the arts. He was a loving husband and father and a brilliant innovator in political campaigning. So all in all, a fascinating character and admirable in many, maybe not all, but in many ways. And in the end, I think that giving Burr his due made for a better story. And I'll pause one moment, again, not enough hands, and have a glass of water here. Hope that was exciting for you as it was for me. So, the book really tries to focus on the interactions between these two men. And I structured the book as a countdown. So the chapters, this is cute, right? The chapters come in reverse order, literally counting down from 10 to 1. I actually got somebody who posted a review on Goodreads, and they said, I realized that the chapters were in reverse order, and I thought maybe they'd made a mistake, but then I said, oh, maybe the author did this on purpose. Well, yes, I did it on purpose. And the idea, in each chapter, I know how many years or months or weeks or hours are left until the duel, because this is a story in which the clock is ticking on the time bomb. And I want readers to remember that fact. So, okay, let me talk a little bit about who these two men were. Both of them were orphans, but from two very different backgrounds. So Alexander Hamilton, born in abject poverty on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. His mother never married his father. She died when he was 13 years old, and he had to fend for himself and eventually came to New York as an impoverished immigrant at age 18. And believe me when I tell you that I have just short-circuited in that description a horrific story of his youth. Very, very difficult time. Amazing that he came out of it at all. But he came to New York at age 18 and started studying at Columbia. So Burr, on the other hand, that's Burr on the left there, if you don't know. Burr, on the other hand, was born into a prominent family, also an orphan, but a prominent family. His maternal grandfather was the famous preacher and theologian Jonathan Edwards. His father, also named Aaron Burr, was the president of what would become known as Princeton. And that's where Aaron Burr is buried, by the way, is at Princeton. His parents died when he was an infant. He was raised by an uncle. He graduated from Princeton at age 16. More common then than now, clearly. But these are two prodigies. These are two young men in a hurry. And it's not clear exactly when they first met, but their lives started to intertwine during the Revolution. Both volunteered, both were commissioned officers. And the first time that I can ascertain they were in the same place at the same time was September 15th, 1776, during one of the most desperate hours of the Battle of New York. So, okay, history quiz here. How many of you consider yourselves fairly familiar with the Battle of New York? Okay, I'm not seeing a lot of hands. I am not surprised, okay? It turns out the Battle of New York was the biggest battle of the American Revolution, as you know. 35,000 British soldiers and sailors versus 25,000 ill-trained colonials. It dwarfs any other battle in the Revolution. Why, then, do we not remember it?
Because they lost.
Because we lost, okay? We got creamed. Washington got creamed. He didn't know what he was doing. Lost the battle. We lived to fight another day. It worked out. But the Battle of New York, not a victory for the Americans. On this particular day, September 15th, 1776, the British landed in Kips Bay, Manhattan, near 34th Street, what is now 34th Street, which is farmland then. Washington tried to rally the troops at an orchard near where the New York Public Library is today, on 42nd Street, but his panicked militia fled up Broadway. Washington was so enraged and disgusted, he flung his hat to the ground in disgust. "Good God," he exclaimed, have I got such troops as these?" By late afternoon, all of the Americans had abandoned Manhattan except for a small contingent manning a fort near Chinatown. They were about to be cut off and surrounded. Aaron Burr, as a staff officer, was instrumental in convincing the colonel who led these troops to withdraw instead of fighting to the death like he wanted to do. In fact, Burr concocted a ruse to make it appear that he had orders for him to withdraw, when in fact no such orders had been given. And Burr leads the men at that fort up into what is now Harlem to the safety of American lines. Well, Alexander Hamilton is one of the soldiers in that unit. He's a lieutenant commanding artillery. So if Burr doesn't intervene then, Alexander Hamilton gets captured and then most likely ends up dying on a prison ship in New York Harbor, and you and I have never heard of him. So that's the time, that's actually only the first time that Burr saved Hamilton's life. He did it again. So Hamilton and Burr were each offered a chance to serve on George Washington's staff. Now, Burr was offered a position in 1776 when he was 20, just before the Battle of New York. Hamilton was offered a position the following year when he was 22. These are such young men. And it's startling how different their experiences were. Burr lasted 10 days, and he left Washington's staff with a bitter taste in his mouth, and he harbored a lifelong dislike of George Washington, which George Washington was happy to reciprocate to Aaron Burr. Hamilton stayed 4 years and became Washington's most important aide and his lifelong protege. And over the years, this fundamental divide over Washington shaped their politics and soured their relationship. And I think this is very important, and it's often kind of paved over a little bit, but this disagreement about Washington. Hamilton thought Washington was one of the greatest men alive or who'd ever lived. Burr once said that he, quote, despised Washington as a man of no talents and one who could not spell a sentence of common English. And these two opinions helped push them in different political directions. So Hamilton becomes a Federalist, working with Washington, believing in a strong national government, strong leadership needed from Washington. Burr goes into the opposition party, what was called then the Democrat-Republican Party, sometimes referred to simply as the Republican Party, although it's different from today's Republican Party. And the mutual antagonism between Washington and Burr resurfaces again and again. And it's sort of like a sunken rock in Hamilton and Burr's relationship. So after the war in 1783, they both go to New York, and they both start law practices there. And it's not the New York we know today by a long shot. It's a New York of 15,000 people. And the statistic that I love about New York from this time is that there were basically about a dozen lawyers in the city. You can go into a Starbucks on Wall Street now and run into a dozen lawyers between you and the latte counter. Okay? There are law firms, most law firms have hundreds of lawyers in New York. There are tens of thousands of lawyers in New York, but there were only a dozen back in 1783. So you can imagine that Burr and Hamilton are thrown into each other's company constantly, in the courtrooms, in the drawing rooms. They're breaking bread at each other's tables. And they presented quite a contrast. Burr was kind of casual in his appearance, almost careless about the way he dressed and groomed his hair. He had a look of what I like to think of as nonchalant elegance. Hamilton, as sort of the young man trying to make a good impression, overcoming his youth, took his look very seriously, believing that smart clothes were essential. He wore elegant suits, and this is my favorite, he had a hairdresser come to his house and groom his hair every day. And who doesn't want that, right? I mean, if you've got the hair, that's an awesome thing. They also had very different styles in the courtroom. Let me read you a little bit about that. I think I can juggle this with two hands. It's a small book, right? So it's not too hard. Hamilton was combative in court, wearing down the other side with beautifully realized but lengthy arguments. He was already exhibiting the take-no-prisoners style that was to alienate so many. He was not content with knocking his opponent in the head, said his friend and fellow attorney Robert Troup, but persisted until he had banished every little insect that buzzed around the ears. The urbane Burr tended to be more persuasive, tapping into the emotions of jurors. He was also much briefer in his delivery than Hamilton. Burr would say as much in half an hour as Hamilton in 2 hours, said one observer who knew and admired them both. Attorney John Van Ness Yates, watching them both in court one day, said that Hamilton appealed to the head while Burr enslaved the heart. Hamilton himself was fascinated and yet perplexed by Burr's courtroom performances. He found Burr's style concise and pleasing, but added, "When I analyzed his arguments, I could never discern in what his greatness consisted." So here you have two young men in New York. They're both lawyers. They're both on the rise. Hamilton, of course, becomes involved in writing the Federalist Papers. He becomes George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Aaron Burr is appointed Attorney General of New York State. Then he's elected as Senator from New York, defeating Hamilton's father-in-law. There's things pulling them apart. There's things bringing them together. Seems like a pretty normal political relationship. But when Burr explores a run for the vice presidency in 1792, Hamilton doesn't just oppose him. He goes nuclear on him. And let me read another excerpt about that. Because Hamilton, he knew how to do some rage. His rage exploded onto the page in an extended rant he shared privately with his closest allies. Burr was, quote, "an unprincipled both as a public and private man. He is for or against nothing but as it suits his interest or ambition. He is determined, as I conceive, to make his way to the head of the popular party and to climb to the highest honors of the state and as much higher as circumstances may permit. Burr, he said, was trying to play the game of confusion, and I feel it a religious duty to oppose his career. That's a religious duty. This is 12 years before they duel at Weehawken. And Hamilton is saying that Burr is a soul beyond redemption. So what happened? Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, Burr got elected senator by defeating Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. Hamilton felt betrayed by this. But there's something deeper going on here. And it has to do, I think, with the differences between the two men. Alexander Hamilton viewed politics as a sacred mission. He had fixed principles that he fought for with all the passion he could muster, and he thought that's what politics was about. Aaron Burr saw politics as a career, kind of like the law, an area to advance in. And his principles were much more flexible, and his allegiances were much more flexible, and depending on what would advance his career and bring him to greater stature in his field. So when Hamilton looked at Burr, he saw a man with no fixed ideology other than winning. And I think this earned Burr a special scorn in Hamilton's pantheon of villains. And Burr, in turn, came to see Hamilton as being warped by fanaticism, allied with his old enemy Washington, and a man who kept getting in his way. And so from that moment on, 12 years before the duel, they were implacable enemies until that morning at Weehawken. Actually, no. Actually, I made that up. They weren't. It turns out they weren't enemies, and one of the most interesting parts of this story is the ebb and flow of their relationship. Despite those harsh words that you heard, a few years later, they seemed tantalizingly close to becoming allies. And to tell you about that, I want to fast forward to a scene in 1797, 7 years to the day before the duel between Hamilton and Burr, in which Hamilton is getting into a dust-up with another founding father whose name we know, James Monroe. I want to read this one. 7 years to the day. Tuesday morning, July 11th, 1797, Hamilton was trembling with rage. The target of his anger was future President James Monroe, who had just returned from Europe upon being recalled as minister to France. When Hamilton accused Monroe of being a liar, the Virginian became equally incensed. The two men leapt out of their chairs and began screaming at each other. "Do you say I represented falsely? You're a scoundrel," Monroe shouted. "I will meet you like a gentleman," Hamilton fired back. "I am ready. Get your pistols," Monroe retorted. Anger management, I think, was what they both needed. But the subject of their argument that day was America's first great political sex scandal. Alexander Hamilton had had an affair with a young married woman named Maria Reynolds, whose husband, James Reynolds, began blackmailing Hamilton over the affair with the knowledge of his wife. So a lovely couple, the Reynolds. Great footnote in American history. It's a delicious story, and we know what happened in a great deal of detail. And why do we know what happened? Because Hamilton wrote a 90-page treatise about it that became known as the Reynolds pamphlet. He did this because he was being accused of being in a corruption scheme and paying off Reynolds as part of a corruption scheme. And they wanted to say, no, I wasn't in a corruption scheme. It was blackmail for sex. And so you see, I'm much less at fault than you would have thought I was. This argument went over about as well then as it did just now in this room. One of the newspaper editors describing Hamilton's argument, his argument was, I am a rake, and therefore I cannot be a thief. Didn't go over that well. Well, for reasons that I go over in the book, Hamilton blames Monroe for news of this affair. And Monroe denies it, and it looks like that they are going to be headed to the dueling ground. They've challenged each other, so now they're lining up seconds. Well, who do you think James Monroe asks to be his second? Aaron Burr. And there's many ironies here, because 2 years before, Monroe had whispered in a coded letter to Jefferson that Burr was a man to be shunned. You already know that Hamilton called him unprincipled, both in public and private. Now, Monroe and Hamilton are kind of both depending on Burr to sort of unravel things and avoid this duel. And he succeeds. Burr manages to actually untangle things. He talks a little bit to Hamilton. He has Monroe withdraw a letter. He smooths things over. And suddenly, after he succeeded in doing this, there's a new rapprochement between Burr and Hamilton. They start working together. They're acting buddy to buddy together. Friends notice this. It doesn't last. History might have turned out a lot differently if it had. But it went on. And if you wonder, don't take my word that history might have turned out differently. Here's what John Adams said. He says, what would have been the consequences of Hamilton and Burr continuing to work together? Shall I say that Hamilton would have been now alive, and Hamilton and Burr now at the head of our affairs? What then? Said Adams, who disliked them both. And his hindsight is something to consider. So as the book counts down towards the duel, we get to the presidential election of 1800. And it looms pretty large, since it comes just 4 years before the face-off at Weehawken. And it once again sets Burr and Hamilton into opposition. And the incumbent president in the election of 1800 is John Adams. He's crotchety, he's brilliant, and he and the Federalists are brandishing, kind of as a weapon, the Alien and Sedition Acts to crush dissent. And congressmen and other editors loyal to the Democrat-Republican Party are being locked up for criticizing the president and his policies. Freedom of the press is under direct assault by the government, even more so than it is that some people believe it is today. And Federalist zeal in these prosecutions knew no bounds. One case involved a couple of tipplers outside a tavern in New Jersey who were amused by the spectacle of the 16-gun salute being given to President Adams as his carriage rode by. Let me see if I can recreate the moment. I brought with me my mug. I should pour some actual water in it, and I can get a drink as part of the presentation, right? If I was really clever, I would have done this in advance. Next time. There goes the president, and they are firing at his ass, bellowed Brown Clark. I don't care if they fire through his ass, bellowed his drinking companion, Luther Baldwin. Pretty funny. Both men went to jail for those remarks. So, the Republicans were certain that if Adams was reelected, it was going to lead to tyranny and one-party rule. So the Republicans put up Thomas Jefferson as their candidate. Now the Federalists feared and hated Jefferson. They were convinced that if he won, it was going to be the blood of the French Revolution, which was ongoing at the time, was going to be happening in America, and it was going to tear the country to shreds. Now I did most of the writing of this book, as I said, last summer, and it was a very weird and intense experience to be immersed in the election of 1800 at the same time I was watching the election of 2016, because there seemed to me a lot of odd parallels. And truly, I'm not sure which one was wilder or more alarming as a campaign. And I'll tell you that when I wrote the first draft of the book and I handed it in September, I referred to the election of 1800 as the wildest election in American history. When I was doing the revisions now in early October, I changed that to say one of the wildest elections in American history. Let me read you one last excerpt from the chapter that deals with the election to give you a taste of what I'm talking about. The fervent belief that so much was at stake, indeed that the fate of the new nation might be in peril, fueled unparalleled personal attacks and deep-seated paranoia. President Adams was decried as a warmonger, a tyrant, a criminal. Republican editor James Callender mocked him as a poor old man and a hideous hermaphroditical character. Jefferson was labeled an atheist, and apocalyptic prophecies were made about a Jefferson presidency. Murder, robbery, rape, and adultery and incest will all be openly taught and practiced, predicted the Hartford Courant, a newspaper which still exists. The air will be rent with the cries of distress, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes if Jefferson is elected. Reverend Thomas Dwight, president of Yale, blustered that under a Jefferson presidency, quote, we may see the Bible cast into the bonfire, we may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution. Housewives in New England buried their Bibles in the gardens, convinced that as president, Jefferson would confiscate and burn them. Anytime you hear that it was a happier, simpler time, it was not. So, let me shortcut to the end. This election results in a tie. It results in a tie in the Electoral College. And let me tell you parenthetically, people had as many issues with the Electoral College in 1800 as they do today. And the tie was not between Jefferson and Adams. The tie was between Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, because the law was written a little differently at the time. They both had the same number of electoral votes. The Constitution didn't say one gets to be president, one gets to be vice president. It said whoever has the most gets to be president. And they had the same number of votes. So they were tied. And so the election had to go to the House of Representatives to vote. Now, virtually every single Federalist in the House of Representatives, virtually every single Federalist in America preferred Aaron Burr to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the devil. He was Satan. He was beyond redemption. Burr was somebody that they thought they could deal with. You know, we're not sure exactly where he stands and everything, but he's a practical man. We can work with Aaron Burr. And so the House deadlocked between Jefferson and Burr because of the Federalists supporting Burr. And the deadlock went on for day after day. 30 votes, no change. Now we're in March of 1801. One Federalist in America, one prominent Federalist took a different position. You know who it is. It's Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton did not like Jefferson. He was not a friend of Jefferson's. They were bitter enemies. In fact, 4 years earlier, Hamilton had written in the election of 1796 that all personal and partial considerations must be discarded, and everything must give way to the great object of excluding Jefferson. But that's back in 1796. Politicians changed their mind. Things changed a little bit. So when we go to 4 years later, it's a different tune. There is no doubt that upon every virtuous and prudent calculation, Jefferson is to be preferred. He is by far not so dangerous a man. And again, now if we listen, here's what Hamilton is saying now in writing letters to all sorts of people about Burr. This man has no principle, public or private. He loves nothing but himself, thinks of nothing but his own aggrandizement, and will be content with nothing short of permanent power in his own hands. And eventually his words helped convince a key Federalist to change his vote, and Jefferson was duly elected on the 33rd ballot. And while Hamilton's attacks were all in private letters, it's almost certain that some of them got back to Burr anyway. You know, Burr was not the kind of guy, it wasn't his style to complain. He's not the kind of person today who would write an angry Facebook post or something. Hamilton was that kind of guy. Hamilton was fire, but Burr was ice. As one Philadelphia newspaper said, admiring of Burr, while others debate, he resolves. While others resolve, he acts. And Burr's icy resolve was to prove fatal to Alexander Hamilton. With 3 years to go, they were now on a collision course for Weehawken. And a lot happens in those last 3 years. A bitter governor's race, New York's so-called pamphlet wars. But now, let's just fast forward one more time to that day of final reckoning. 4 people were present at the duel. I know there's 5 in the illustration. It's very hard to find an accurate period illustration of this, but there were 4 people present. Hamilton and Burr in their 2 seconds. Do you know what a second is? Okay, yeah, it's like you pick somebody to be your assistant, your aide-de-camp at the duel. So the question everybody wants to know is who fired first? Did Hamilton throw away his shot, as he suggested he would the night before? And did Burr kill him in cold blood? Or did it go the other way around? And the problem with this is that the accounts of what happened leading up to the duel are all in perfect harmony. Right up to that bit with Hamilton fiddling with his glasses, right up to Nathaniel Pendleton says, present. And after that point, the accounts of the people who were present diverged wildly. Hamilton, of course, is shot, doesn't have a lot to say about what happened. His second is emphatic in saying that Burr fired first, and that Hamilton only fired involuntarily when the bullet struck him. But Burr and his second emphatically say the opposite. They say Hamilton fired first, and that Burr fired a few seconds later. So what I tried to do in this book is lay out both theories and let you try to figure it out. And the thing is, there's a whole lot of little details. There were hair triggers on the pistols. Were the hair triggers used? What did Hamilton actually say? Whether he was going to throw away his shot? What did Burr actually say? What's all the evidence? I put it all in there and let people try to figure it out. I mean, I think that 2 centuries after the fact, it's impossible to know exactly what happened. And strongly held opinions about who fired first, and thus who should be blamed, tend, I think, to depend on the person's view of Hamilton and Burr. So if you like Burr, you tend to think that Hamilton fired first, and vice versa. And I don't think, in general, that those opinions depend on careful sifting.
Going home.
I'm losing one member of the audience, but it's okay. Almost done. Not long ago, I stayed with some New York friends who have an 11th grade daughter. And during her teenage years, anybody have or had a teenage daughter here? Okay, so yeah. During her teenage years, she's been, pardon? Granddaughter. Well, she's been caught up in her own world. She's been a little bit non-communicative. To me, as a visitor, I very rarely got more than a bored hello from her when I was visiting. But this last time, when I mentioned that I was working on a book about Hamilton and Burr, she suddenly became a different person. And we talked for about 20 minutes before she went to school in the morning, and she was entranced by the show. She wanted to know everything she could about the real story. And now, what's more, she was becoming interested in Andrew Jackson, because now that's who they were studying at school, and she'd come to realize that the history could be interesting, and a flame had been lit. And I think that's just a wonderful thing about this story. This is a piece of history that continues to be relevant today. Many of the issues are the same. Big government versus small government, elites versus the common people, national debt, immigration, freedom of the press. It's startling that we're still arguing about some of these same issues 200 years later. The story of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton is an inspiration, a warning, a tragedy, a murder mystery, not much of a mystery, and a primer on early America. It's got it all, right? Sex, violence, politics, jealousy, guys wearing wigs. It's vastly entertaining, but it also casts an illuminating light on our country and ourselves. And it's been a great pleasure tonight to be able to talk about it a little bit, and hopefully I'll get to talk to you about it some more if you have some questions. Thank you so much. So, I'm happy to take questions from all corners. Anybody want to start? Over here.
If Burr's version was right, that Alexander Hamilton shot first, wouldn't that be an indication that Hamilton did pull the shot? Or did he hit it?
Well, they're firing pistols like this, which are incredibly inaccurate.
Except that he hit Hamilton.
It does happen. People get lucky. People hit things. The musket ball that Hamilton fired did go hit a tree branch above and to the side of Burr. So, you know, he could have fired first and be intentionally missing. He could have fired first and be a bad shot. The hair trigger, there were hair triggers on these pistols. Supposedly they were not set. Maybe the hair trigger was set. Hair trigger means that the pistol, instead of taking 5 pounds of pressure to go off on the trigger, takes just the lightest of touch. This does not happen. It's not a real pistol. It does not have a hair trigger. But in the case, if you had a hair trigger, maybe when he's bringing it up, he fires, and actually it's coming down. It's coming down like this, right? Starting like this, coming down, maybe it goes off here before he gets it all the way down. It's perfectly possible. It really, I looked at this carefully to say, is there a real reason to think that one guy shot first and the other guy didn't? The biggest reason to think that Hamilton didn't shoot first is he told everybody, his second, his wife, all these people, he was not going to fire first. He was not going to fire first at Burr. But now think for a minute, what happened right before the duel? I told you about it. Hamilton is fiddling with his glasses. Let me tell you that whole story. Okay, what happens is that Pendleton says they're just about ready to say present, and Hamilton says stop. He says stop, and they look at him, and his glasses aren't on yet. And he says sometimes in the light, in the dawn light, you need glasses to see things better. And he pulls his glasses out of his pocket, and then he goes through this thing where he's looking with the glasses and without the glasses, and kind of aiming his pistol, squinting. What's it going to work? What's going to be better? Now imagine you're on the other end of that. And you're Aaron Burr. What are you going to think? You think, oh, he's probably throwing away his shot. That's not what I'd be thinking. I'd be thinking, oh my God, that guy is out to kill me.
Is that a real pistol?
No. It probably could be a real pistol, but it is not. It's a replica.
Because they're pointing it right at me.
Yes, well, I like to be armed when I speak because audiences can be tricky sometimes. My son bought me this in France, and then how he got it back to me, I do not know. But I guess he bought it at Les Invalides. It's a Napoleonic era pistol. It's not identical to their dueling pistols, but it's pretty darn close. It's the exact same kind of pistol. Sir?
You should never point the
Yes,
pistol
my
at people
understanding is
because
that when Mr. Hamilton,
Hang on 1 second. Go ahead.
oh, sorry,
you should never point the weapon at people because there's been people killed with weapons that had no shells in them.
Yes, well, thank you very much. It is not a real pistol, so it can't fire, but I
I
appreciate
don't
it.
even like to look at it.
I'm sorry to panic you. I won't do it again. Sir?
I'm sorry to interrupt that gentleman. I thought you were pointing to me. In the meantime, Mr. Hamilton, I understand that he had no intention of killing Aaron Burr, and that he was going to, like his son, the same way, he was going to just fire in the air. And he thought Aaron Burr would do the same. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. And I'm curious, what caliber was the bullet?
It was, I think, it's a 54 caliber. It's a big bullet. It's, I actually say this in the front. It is a 50 caliber red ball.
It is a 50 caliber.
And so Hamilton did say he was not going to fire at Burr. You can say a lot of things, but you're in the moment. I don't know, and you don't know, and nobody knows what was in his heart at that moment. And the thing is that, he left a note saying I wasn't going to fire at Burr, but of course if he survived it, he could have thrown away that note. So, I am not convinced either way. I went back and forth about 4 times in writing as to who I believed, and in the end, I'm just not sure that you can really know. But he did indeed say he was going to throw away his shot.
Did Aaron Burr know that?
No, he had no idea.
No idea that he wasn't planning on shooting?
No idea that he'd said he wasn't planning on shooting. Right, and that's what I'm saying is if you're a Burr, and you see all this fiddling with the glasses and the pistol and the sighting, your adrenaline's going up. Just like this gentleman when I pointed the pistol at him and he didn't even think that I was thinking about shooting him. But now Aaron Burr knows it's a loaded pistol and that he might be shooting it at him. So I think that it might be very understandable for Burr to be shooting to kill.
Should he have known?
How would he have known? Hamilton didn't. If Hamilton said he wasn't going to fire at Burr, that would be a loss of honor. He could say that privately. He can't say it publicly. It's part of the dueling, weird dueling code of the time.
I'm wondering how many duels either one of them, how many times had their honor been insulted so that they had been in other duels?
Hamilton had been challenged or challenged somebody, I'm trying to remember, I think it's about 6 times, but it had never gotten to the firing line. Most duels didn't happen. Most times when somebody was challenged to a duel, they worked it out. Just like that thing with Hamilton and Monroe, where Aaron Burr worked it out between the two of them. Somebody apologizes, or somebody withdraws their comment, or says they were misunderstood, or they find some way to rectify it. So probably 90% of duels don't actually end up, 90% of what they would refer to as affairs of honor don't end up as actual duels where people are firing. One of my favorite dueling stories, totally unrelated to this book, can I tell it to you anyway?
Yeah.
Okay, so it involves Abraham Lincoln. Did you know Abraham Lincoln was involved in one of these incidents? Okay, so it was back in Illinois in, I think, the 1840s. You know, it's long before he's a prominent national figure. But he's involved in state politics, and he basically he writes a letter to the newspaper mocking James Shields, who was the auditor, the state auditor in Illinois. And it's an anonymous letter, but James Shields is a very angry, borderline violent Irish man with a temper, and he walks into the editor's office and basically says, "Tell me who wrote that letter, or I'll, wring your neck." And the editor says, "Abraham Lincoln." And so Shields challenges Lincoln to a duel, and Lincoln accepts. Now Lincoln, as the challenged person, has the right to pick what weapon they're going to duel with. Lincoln picks broadswords. Now, James Shields is about this high. Abraham Lincoln's about this high. He's got really long arms, and so he's going to have a decided advantage with broadswords. And so they all row out, it's just like in New York, they all go to New Jersey to duel. So in Illinois, they were going to, Indiana or someplace. But they row across the river to the dueling ground. And now you have, they're getting ready, and Lincoln has taken his jacket off, and he's got his broadsword in his hand, and he's, doing, dramatically slashing branches off of trees and stuff. And Shields is kind of eyeing this. And Shields talks to his second, and the seconds talk, and Shields, they find a way to resolve this, because he didn't really want to be doing broadswords with Abraham Lincoln. And so they go back, and nothing more happens with that. And James Shields actually eventually was one of Lincoln's generals in the Civil War. He was a general in the Union Army under Lincoln. But there was a story that Lincoln told, I think in the boat on the way across to this duel, of the soldier whose girlfriend knitted him a sweater that said "Victory or Death." And the soldier looked at it and said, "Well, couldn't it just say, like, victory or be crippled?" Death was a little too hard. Dueling and Abraham Lincoln. Sorry, I got off topic. I'm going to just see if there's anybody else first, just to give people, but there's not. They are deferring to you, so.
It's just, because you brought it up, why did they go to New Jersey? Why did they just do it in Manhattan?
Well, in the Broadway show, they say, everything's legal in New Jersey. Dueling was illegal in both places. But New York tended to prosecute more than New Jersey did. And so what they wanted to do was go someplace where they basically want to be alone, right? No witnesses. And then if they're in New Jersey, there's less chance of it being prosecuted. Also, it's harder for New Jersey to prosecute since none of the people involved are in New Jersey. Now they're all in some other state. So that was the basic idea behind it.
Was he forgiven for doing that?
So,
What was his life like?
not really. So, Burr was actually quite surprised at the negative reaction. He felt that this was an affair of honor. There had been many others, but there was this suddenly. What happens is that Alexander Hamilton basically becomes a martyr about 2 minutes after he dies. And he's a martyr, and at this point, the Republicans are angry at Burr because he ran against Jefferson. The Federalists are angry at Burr because he's a Republican, and he kills Hamilton, and they all have reasons, political reasons, to like dump on him. So, so suddenly Hamilton becomes a martyr, and Burr becomes the terrible villain who did this. And he's quite shocked. He's quite shocked that this happens. And he decides to split town. He heads south for a while. He's in Georgia for a while, where there are some people, so strong are the political currents, there are some people who are congratulating him for shooting Hamilton. Eventually things start to die down a bit, and he goes back to Washington. And keep in mind, he's still vice president. He's still vice president. And he goes back to Washington, where he presides over the Senate and presides over an impeachment trial of a judge, I think it was Samuel Chase. And so, but he's kind of like, you know, his political career is obviously over. And it's during this period that he starts to communicate with the British ambassador to the United States and gets involved in a plot which eventually leads to a treason trial 3 years later. So no, Burr never really recovers. You know, Hamilton was killed, but Burr's career was effectively ended the same day. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity. If anybody wants to buy one, if you want to chat more, I'm happy to chat more. And I'm really delighted to be here. I hope you